What's up, everybody? Joe Brown here. This is the Heresy Financial Show, and today we are looking at Joe Biden's recently announced plan to fight inflation. So he talked about a three-pronged approach to fighting inflation. We are going to dissect it point by point to see whether or not this plan will actually combat inflation, whether it will contribute to inflation, or potentially something even worse. Ready? Let's dive in. Before we jump in, it is no secret that Bitcoin is on sale. You can start buying the dip, dollar cost averaging in. That's called stacking sats in the Bitcoin community, and there's no better way to do that than with Swan Bitcoin. The cheapest, easiest, most secure way. Sign up for Swan Bitcoin using my link in the description below, and you'll get $10 worth of Bitcoin just for signing up. All right, so Joe Biden announced his plan to fight inflation. It is a three-pronged approach. Let's take a look at each part of the plan and see what the results of this will actually be, given a correct understanding of how the economy and how money works. The first thing that Biden said is trust the Fed. He said, I've appointed fantastic people to the Federal Reserve. They know how to do their job, and they agree that the number one priority right now is to combat inflation. So what's the problem with this? The problem is the Federal Reserve is the cause of the current inflation. So he's saying, hey, trust the Fed. They're the ones that made the situation that we're currently in happen. So yes, they are now looking at it and saying, hey, our number one priority is to fight inflation, but they didn't have enough foresight to see, or maybe they didn't care, that's probably more likely, that what they were doing was going to cause inflation and potentially runaway inflation like we are experiencing right now. Now, of course, the ball's not all in their court. They did it in conjunction with the federal government. The federal government spent a bunch of money. They had to borrow a bunch in order to make that spending because they weren't getting enough from taxes in order to spend that. And there was nobody in the economy who had enough money to lend to the government for all the borrowing they needed to do. So they borrowed that money from the Fed, who printed that money into existence. The massive increase in the quantity of money, it got injected into the economy through various mechanisms, and it started bidding up prices as it got spent from one party to another on various things, worked its way throughout the economy, bid up prices, and now we're in a situation where prices are continuing to go up month after month, and the year-over-year numbers are worse than they've been in decades. So you say, okay, but fine, they are trying to fight inflation now. So what's the problem with that? The problem with it is the same problem as before. They didn't have enough foresight to see the consequences of their actions. And right now, they are raising rates. Right now, starting in June, they are aggressively tightening. That's selling assets off of their balance sheet. Right now, they are keeping the reverse repo rate higher than the federal funds rate, sucking up cash out of the system, over $2 trillion in the reverse repo market right now. So they are engaging in three different actions right now that are all sucking cash out of the financial system. These are all highly deflationary forces. Not saying that they result in actual deflation. I'm saying these forces are deflationary. Now, is it possible that's not enough to counteract the current inflation that we're experiencing and the current inflationary forces? Absolutely. But it's also possible this is a rug pull. It's also possible they are overdoing it here, and right at the same time as a bunch of pent-up deflationary or disinflationary forces are going to work their way throughout the economy, which we'll get into, we're also going to experience the consequences of the new monetary actions by the Federal Reserve to combat inflation, and things could start crashing epically and quickly everywhere. But more on that later. Now let's take a look at the second thing that Biden said as part of his plan to fight inflation. And he basically talked about energy prices. He said prices at the pump are elevated because Russian oil, gas, and refining capacity are off the market, and that they need to pass clean energy tax credits and investments that he has proposed. Further, he blamed Putin and said, we can't let up on our global effort to punish Mr. Putin for what he's done. Okay, so first of all, it's not what Putin has done that has caused energy prices to do what they're doing. Energy prices were skyrocketing long before Russia invaded Ukraine. Second, it is the punishment, the response to that invasion that has made the current oil and gas and energy crisis worse. These are self-inflicted wounds. Next, Biden said that we need to pass clean energy tax credits and investments. So first, let's talk about these credits. I am all for tax credits. I think there is not a single entity in the world that is more irresponsible with how it spends money than the federal government of the United States. And so anything that says somebody is able to pay less in taxes, which means that's purchasing power that's being kept away from the federal government and being kept in the hands of whoever it is, I'm all for that. Now, it's very unfair when that happens for specific areas and not for other areas. Maybe when it happens for businesses and not for individuals, or when it happens for specific demographics or wealth groups, or depending on how many kids you have or anything like that. And those are all ways that the federal government tries to incentivize behavior. So they think, hey, this will be good for the country, this will be good for the country, this won't be. So we are going to incentivize these things with deductions and credits, and we are not going to incentivize these things because we want more of this to happen. Now, not only is the federal government the most financially irresponsible entity, I also think they're misguided. So do I think that they are correct in the behaviors that they're trying to incentivize on whether that will be good for the country or not? Absolutely not. However, you also have to consider that's keeping money out of their hands. So at this point, just in general for credits, I'm for it. Now, the problem is the misallocation of resources and the diversion of resources from one thing to another. And that's where we also have to talk about that second part of it, which is investments in clean energy. Because at the base issue of this is that resources are scarce. That is the fundamental nature of the universe, is that everything is scarce. And things only become abundant through human action. We bring abundance out of scarcity, and that is wealth. When we have an abundance of food, where things in their natural state, food is scarce, that is wealth. Same thing with shelter, same thing with clothing, same thing with leisure, same thing with everything in life. We bring abundance from scarcity. We create abundance out of scarcity. That is true wealth growth. But the default state is scarcity. So we have a limited number of resources at our disposal, and we are constantly trying to choose the best path forward to use the resources that are available to us in the best way possible that will be most valuable for us individually. That's what human action is comprised of. It's a list all day long going from one thing to the other and saying, I've got all these choices in front of me. I'm going to do the thing that's most valuable to me given all things that are considered in this moment. And when you have a third party who is able to come in and say, I'm going to offer an artificial reward on one thing or another, that is going to change the value rankings that everybody has. For instance, if we know the government is offering tax credits and it is offering money to invest in clean energy, I might make my business more aligned with those needs, more aligned with the government's wants in order to take advantage of that, because what I was going to do might not be as profitable now as going that direction simply because of the investments and the credits from the government. This means that if they're wrong, that means that the change in behavior will result in less wealth, more wealth destruction relative to what would have been otherwise. It also means that there is a real diversion of resources. Take, for instance, a very crude example here of steel. And let's say there's some steel required to make large batteries. And they say, hey, we want cities and states to start investing in large battery arrays to store up energy from solar and wind so that during the peak hours, they can store up that energy and then deliver it at night, all the utility companies. So the federal government wants to give money to that. Well, that's real steel then that now is more profitable for individual actors to divert that steel into creating batteries for the utility companies, and they profit as a result of it. And now that steel is diverted to that goal instead of something like making cars, which means that in the end, cars might adjust up in price because the resources available are still scarce. There's a limited supply of them, and they're being artificially diverted from one area which they would have been otherwise naturally, and now because of an artificial incentive, they're redirected another way, which means that if your utility bill goes down by $500 a year as a result of this, well, that won't really matter to you if the next car you have to buy is $5,000 more, right? And so we have to take into account everything when making decisions, but the government just takes into account what is politically expedient. Okay, finally, the last thing that he said is we need to keep reducing the federal deficit, which will help ease price pressures. This absolutely. I am so happy that he said this, so happy that this is what is coming out of the mouth of the sitting president. We haven't had a statement like this in decades. It's been forever since the sitting president has said, hey, let's reduce the deficit. And I know presidents who have been campaigning recently have said that, but if you look at their track record, the deficits did the exact opposite. And so hearing something like this, fantastic. Now, what about the actions? Do the actions line up? Let's see. Last week, the Congressional Budget Office projected the deficit will fall by $1.7 trillion this year. That is the largest reduction in history. That's not saying the smallest deficit in history, because the smallest deficit would be, zero, a balanced budget, or then you go negative, you get a surplus, and we've had surpluses in history. It's just saying the change. So the budget last year, how much the government spent versus brought in, and then this year, that's the biggest change in going the right direction, shrinking the deficit. Now, here's the problem. Here's the problem with this. It's not for lack of trying here. This was not on purpose. In fact, Biden actually kind of admits to this on accident. He says this deficit progress wasn't preordained. I think what he's trying to say there is he was basically saying, hey, this wasn't going to happen automatically. And that's partially true, partially not true. Now, it's not for lack of trying here. What the administration has tried to do since it got in is spend and spend and spend and spend. And because of political gridlock, they have not been able to be doing any spending whatsoever. And so what was the result of this? Well, we had a bunch of money printing, got injected into the economy, prices skyrocketed, wages skyrocketed, assets skyrocketed, everything skyrocketed, transactions taking place everywhere. That means tax revenue goes up because prices go up. And so the government gets a cut of all of those prices. Capital gains taxes, wages, employment taxes, employer taxes, everything. The government's getting a cut of a much larger dollar amount. And so, yes, the federal government's income has been astronomical this year. So as a result of the inflation, their income has skyrocketed. And as a result of political gridlock, the federal government's expenses have dropped off of a cliff. That means they're basically on accident balancing the budget. Again, it's not on purpose. It's not like they were trying to do this, but it is what's happening, which is a good thing. We need less government spending, not more. Now, will this fight inflation? Absolutely. The government balancing the budget and turning, maybe even getting to a surplus at some point, absolutely is a deflationary force that sucks money out of circulation. Whether you increase taxes, whether the government increases borrowing, whether the government spends less or does all three, that's more money the government is sucking out of circulation. They're taking it out of the economy. That's less money in circulation able to be used to bid for purchasing things, which means all else being equal, prices would come down as a result. There's less money relative to all the stuff, meaning the money is more valuable relative to all the stuff. It's said another way, that stuff is cheaper relative to the money that you are using to measure the stuff. So absolutely, the federal government sucking money out of circulation through taxes, borrowing, and less spending, in other words, balancing the budget, shrinking the deficit, that is a deflationary force. So we just looked at the three things that Biden said they are planning to do in order to fight inflation. Number one, trust the Fed, the Fed is doing things right now that are technically deflationary. You can argue about whether they're powerful enough forces to combat the inflation that we have right now, but they are deflationary forces, especially starting in June. We are also looking at the federal government's plan to increase tax credits and investments for clean energy. That's not going to make an impact. In fact, that'll probably just make other things more expensive because they're diverting resources into something that they should not be making decisions for, diverting those resources. But the third thing, balancing the budget, absolutely deflationary. So what we're looking at here is rising rates from the Fed, quantitative tightening, which is selling assets off their balance sheet from the Fed, the reverse repo facility, all-time highs, sucking cash out of circulation. All three things by the Fed, massively deflationary forces. Pair that with the federal government balancing their budget. potentially raising taxes, the tax rates, in addition to their tax revenue going through the roof, borrowing as much as they can, spending less and less and less from political gridlock. Those are all deflationary forces. This could be a rug pull. We could get a massive deflationary collapse as we are seeing so many deflationary forces deployed on the economy all at once. These things take time, remember? The Federal Reserve, even Powell has said this before. Back in 2017, I believe it was, he was saying, hey, when we do something with interest rates, it's, a year before that has an impact on the economy. The M2 money supply has not grown in over a year. It is basically flat. It's trickled up a little bit, but nothing like it was doing during 2020 and 2021. So the money supply is not growing as fast as it was before, and now we are starting to hit that with all these deflationary forces. It's very possible we get a huge deflationary crash that they're going to have to step in and try and bail out once again. So that is my take on Biden's approach to the current inflation that we're experiencing. Some of it ineffective, some of it very effective, and we will have to wait and see how effective the whole thing really is, and whether we get this rug pull that I've been talking about for like a year now on this channel. And once we do get that crash that I think we're going to, what they do as a response. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.